Aloha everyone, my name is Chelsea Anasio and I'm the moderator for this morning's session. This session is broken up into two presentations. The first is Proposed Rules to Address Non-Point Source Pollution with the Side of Recognition presented by Matthew Kurano, and the second is Inspection Targeting and Increased Penalties presented by Bobbie Teixeira. Matt and Bobbie both work for the Department of Health Clean Water Branch in the enforcement section. You might know them if you have an Mpds permit or have been inspected. If you're in the Mpds game long enough, you guys will probably cross paths. Please use the Q&A feature during this presentation to ask any questions you may have. At the end of the presentation, they will have a few minutes to answer your questions. Please help me welcome Matt and Bobbie.
Thanks, Chelsea. You want us to share screen now?
Yes, you can share your screen.
All right. So hopefully I got this right. Is everybody seeing the right screen? Chelsea, am I showing the right screen? Well, I hope so. Okay. So welcome everybody. My name is Matt, Department of Health, Clean Water Branch. I see a lot of you in the participant list, and hi to all the people I haven't seen for a while. It's been a while, huh? March. I'm going to kind of blow through some of this because I know everybody's actually in this session to hear about how they're going to get penalized from Bobbie. So with that, let's start. I'm going to start talking a little bit about non-point source versus point source. And if you were in the city's conference, I guess 2 weeks ago, I started talking about new rules that we're about to propose. And I want to get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty. If you didn't see that particular presentation, then I added a few slides on the front end just to catch us up, but good luck. So, just as a review, everybody gets super hung up on point source versus non-point source. What is a point source? What is a non-point source? What's really important to understand is the distinction between point source and non-point source doesn't represent the real world. It's not like there are specific features that make you a point source versus a non-point source. Point source and non-point source are regulatory distinctions in the Clean Water Act that help us determine what we're going to regulate under NPDES and what we're not. And why does that make a difference? Well, NPDES is really a federal construct, sometimes implemented through the states, as in Hawaii. But what the federal government doesn't have authority to regulate are the category of dischargers considered non-point source dischargers. There are certain ones that are categorically exempt, like agriculture is categorically exempt from being regulated by the EPA because the states, when passing, or Congress representing the states, when passing the Clean Water Act, explicitly pointed out that the regulation of agriculture is something that's best left to the states. So each individual state, for instance, regulates agriculture. It doesn't mean it's not regulated. It just means it's not regulated by the federal government from a water pollution standpoint. Now, I talk about that a lot because there's a hyper focus on point sources being tied to the language of discrete conveyances and pipes. And that might be somewhat true, but I think there's an overemphasis. I really want people understanding that, look, anything can be a pollution source. And ones in which we can solely understand that the pollution is from you should be subject to NPDES, point source, unless you're categorically exempt, like agriculture. Otherwise, the state needs to come up with other tools necessary to prevent pollution from sources that aren't best regulated by NPDES. We all know, even in this conference, we have this great point source program in Hawaii, and the EPA does as well, right? We have MS4 permits, we have wastewater treatment plant permits, and they all prevent pollution to our receiving waters with the implementation of end of pipe limits, sometimes somewhat abstract, like maximum extent practicable, but for the most part, it's end of pipe limits. What lacks is any mechanism to ensure pollution from sources that are not considered point source subject to NPDES. So the state had recognized this, and honestly, it started before this, but we're government. So if you think permits take a long time for you to get a permit, try creating a rule. You're talking about years in construct. So we really began in like 2018, but in earnest in 2019, and the DOH, because the director is the trustee for water quality and responsible for essentially surface water pollution in Hawaii, developed this rule set. So in the non-point source world, everything to this point in Hawaii from a water pollution standpoint was a voluntary practice. So it's not that there weren't existing ways to address non-point source pollution, it's just that they weren't obligated. So what we did is we took a lot of those practices and we've codified them in administrative rules and made them obligatory for certain categories of discharger. In particular, government agencies, does it sound familiar for those of you in this Mpds, MS4 world, that are associated, that conduct activities on a large scale, again, similar to the MS4 world, in agriculture, forestry, marinas, urban areas, hydromodifications, and wetland and riparian areas. There are 6 major categories, but the last 3 categories, urban areas, hydromodifications, and wetlands, haven't had any rules proposed yet, but we hope to in the future if we ever get past this first bunch. So for this first group that we will be going out to public notice on very soon in the next few months are agriculture, forestry, and marinas. This is just kind of a schematic, which everyone hates because it's all blue, about addressing point source and non-point source, right? Point source is analogous with industrial sources, wastewater, stormwater. This whole non-point source side doesn't exist yet, but this is what we're proposing. Agriculture, forestry, and marinas, how would it work? So the body of 1156, which is Hawaii Administrative Rule 1156, or the regulations we're proposing, will define that anybody who is in a category that meets the criteria. And right now, the automatic criteria, very much like MS4s, is government-owned agencies in general with a certain size trigger. So if a government agency only owns 1 acre and does agriculture, leases it out or something, do they require some kind of a non-point source program? No. If they have 1,000 acres, yes. If a government-owned agency has significant forestry lands, which they do, right? DLNR conservation lands, or marinas like under DOBOR, then they would need to be part of this non-point source regulatory program. And the body of 1156 lays out the criteria on what that means. Then, again, those of you who do what we do a lot of general permits via appendices in the rules. And so similarly, we would be doing sector-specific requirements under appendices in 1156, the proposed 1156. Okay, so is it a permit? How would it work? What do you have to do? So if you met a trigger, so let's say you're a government agency that has properties over 1,000 acres that you lease out to do ag, what do you have to do? Well, under the proposed rules, you have to register with the Department of Health. You wouldn't be getting a permit, you'd be registering. And you'd register what we would consider the facility or the property itself. Now there'd be triggers of when you have to register. So 30 days, these are new rules, right? So the properties already exist. So is it the day that the rule goes into effect that you have to register, or do you have some time? And we built in some time, obviously. What does registration entail? It means that we know you're there, right? Your name, ownership type, mailing address, that type of thing. What's good about the registry is kind of like a permit is that you don't have to keep doing it. It's good for 5 years unless there's some significant change at your facility. We'd be issuing you a facility ID number, which would be kind of analogous to a permit number, but it makes a whole lot more sense if you ever want to get into the weeds about that one. For agriculture, here's the decision tree. Are you a public agency? Yes. If yes, then do you operate lands or own or operate lands larger than 1,000 contiguous acres? If the answer is yes, then you got to register. And then once you register, that triggers what your regulatory requirements are. The biggest regulatory requirement is that you develop a water pollution prevention plan. Again, sounds super familiar, right? For those of us that are in the MS4 world, swamps, for those of us in construction, SWIPs, this would be a WIP. We learned a lot of lessons from the stormwater world, and this having a good plan and following your plan, that seems to be a really good best practice. Okay, so what is the WIP? All right, you've registered, you got to describe your facility, describe your activities, and describe your pollution control measures. Maybe the only thing slightly different about it than the approach we take for everything else is you really just got to list what it is that you're going to be doing to ensure that the practices are done. Remember, this primarily targets government agencies that lease out 1,000 acres to the Bobbie Teixeira company. And, you know, then Bobbie's company has to make sure that she implements all these things. But as a landowner, as a government landowner, I need to make sure that she is in fact doing them all. You certify it, submit it, you know, and maybe we have comments, maybe we don't, and then you implement it. And every year your compliance requirement is an annual report. No discharge monthly, no monthly discharge monitoring reports. This WIP becomes the basis of your compliance, just like the SWIPs do for construction and the SWAMPs do for MS4. So we didn't deviate that much from the a really working model. And like anything else, you're going to be disclosing your self-monitoring requirements. What's very different about it is what we didn't want was overlapping regulation. So your erosion sediment control plans by the city and your stormwater control plans under Mpds, sometimes they overlap, right? In this case, if you had something that's an equivalent, so for agriculture, you may have a soil conservation plan authorized by the conservation district. We would look at that as an equivalent and you could submit it instead of, as long as it meets all the requirements. The last one I want to talk about is the annual reports. It's not meant to be really long. Are we really concerned? One of the things we worry about is creating just a huge paperwork lift that, you know, we may or may not read all the time. Should these rules pass, we'll be developing templates for your reportables, and it should be very simple. In fact, the MS4 world itself is going in that direction. Eventually, we'll be doing inspections, making sure you're registered, making sure you have a WIP and you're implementing the WIP. And most importantly, make sure that you're implementing the BMPs for whatever, whether it's forestry, whether it's marinas, whether it's agriculture, to prevent the pollution from discharging. That's the end all be all. And we see it as harmonious with the desires actually for each of those categories. In agriculture, there's no desire to lose your dirt or to lose your fertilizer because of over-fertilization. You know, in forestry, you want to maintain the forest. In marinas, you don't want to be polluting your marina water, where that's where you're coming into contact with it. So we see it as very harmonious, but it is a backstop to ensure that it's being done. You know, as much as I love to think everything voluntary would be wonderful, turns out we don't always do what we're supposed to do, what we should be doing. So just what would be our general approach? For the first 5 years, it would really be making sure that people come into the program and education, that the programs are developed. How are we going to go out on the first day and start hitting people with fines? That doesn't even make sense. So the program approach would be a lot of compliance assistance for the first 5 years. There's not even going to be a branch or huge program to do it. So from a practical standpoint, there's not going to be anybody to fine you. There would be only people to provide compliance assistance for the first few years. And then over the second, assuming we can get past agriculture, forestry, and marinas, then the next rollout would be protocols and procedures for urban areas, hydro modifications, and wetlands. And I think that makes a lot of sense. There's areas of the state that are not under MS4s that are urban areas that could benefit from post-construction requirements, but MS4 light requirements, not the full-blown IDDE alpha inspection programs. I certainly think a lot of you that are in the CIP programs know that hydro modifications are a huge, maintenance of infrastructure is a big thing, and trying to get through 401s because they don't really have clear standards can be difficult, but that they have lasting impacts on our environment. So we would need to start developing BMPs, essentially structural BMPs, when hydro modifications need to be done. This is a real, to me, that it's a huge 21st century issue, right? With sea level rise and the failing infrastructure. And of course, protections for wetlands, particularly in light of the new water, the US rules, where some state waters won't be waters of the US. So that's the new rules. So what I also said was a little bit of recognition. I'm happy to share that we completed a MS4 audit of DOT, the Highways Oahu District Program. I don't think they knew I was going to say anything about this. I didn't send them this slide ahead of time. Probably made them a little nervous. One of the things we came up with was identifying parts of their program that were really outstanding and noteworthy. And we actually put gold stars on their, not stickers, I didn't have stickers. We had icons on the report itself. So if you're ever interested, there's a 120-page audit report for them. But if you're interested about the good stuff and not just the bad stuff, you can scroll down the left side and you can see areas where we put a gold star. Notable aspects of their program included very good program management from the very top all the way through the different supervisors that implement the different roles and responsibilities. They have a great swamp. So kudos to all the guys, and you know who you are, that actually do the writing for the swamp. Good job. The asset management program is very well done. Their staffing levels and the way they oversee the maintenance schedules and the asset approach is great. And like the swamp, I'm sure it's probably similar guys who write it. The annual report quality was really good, very noteworthy. These are things that we share internally. We share with some of our other MS4 permittees. And I know at this point already, they're starting to be shared throughout the nation as our consultants and as EPA kind of goes forward and shows best practices. So kudos to you. I wanted to be able to focus on some great stuff that you guys are out doing. So thank you. That's all I got for today, Chelsea.
So I can start, but Matt, you have to stop sharing.
It's not the first time I've heard that one. There's a question. Chelsea, you want to do the questions at the end? You want to do them now?
We can do the questions at the end.
Okay.
Okay. So are you guys all seeing that screen now? Okay, hopefully you are. Hi guys, thanks for having me. I can't see any of your guys' faces, but if I could, I'm sure there are a bunch of you out there that I would recognize. But at least DOT was still able to provide this conference for you guys. I'm gonna try and go through this quickly because I know that it's lunchtime, and like Matt says, we do take lunch very seriously here at the DOH. There should be more than enough time for questions, and if not, then you guys all should know how to get a hold of us already. So since most of you guys are already familiar with the whole Clean Water Act history, Clean Water Branch mission, the Mpds program overview, I'm gonna skip all of that and I'm gonna jump into what it is that you guys really wanna know, which is, when can I expect an inspection from the Department of Health? Sorry, there's a lag in the, there it is. Okay, so it's pretty simple, really. Inspections are based on the level of resources that we have available. We can only do as many inspections as people we have available to do them. Right now, there are only 6 of us in the enforcement, and that's including Matt, and he's quite busy putting out a lot of fires around here, so I'm sure he doesn't get out and do as much inspections as he would really like to. So really that only leaves 5 of us. But we do try to prioritize, and we try and get the most bang for the buck. But first and foremost, we are committed to protecting our waters and the health of those who recreate in them. So therefore, we will prioritize inspections of those that pose the greatest risk. And that goes for all of the islands in the state. So we will drop whatever it is that we are doing to focus on those types of threats. We are also committed to meeting our goals for the Mpds compliance monitoring strategy, which outlines inspection frequencies of Mpds regulated facilities. So EPA's national CMS represents the minimum inspection frequencies that an enforcement program must have. But it also provides flexibility, and it allows states to develop alternative strategies. And this is to be able to address their most important water quality problems. So this is really great because Hawaii's problems are not going to be the same as some other states like Arizona or Utah or the contiguous 48, really. I mean, we are on an island after all. So therefore, the DOH does take advantage of this option, and we developed Hawaii's Mpds compliance monitoring strategy. It is mostly consistent with the national CMS, but it does have a little bit of deviation that is unique for Hawaii. And the Hawaii Mpds CMS does get approved by EPA before we do implement it. So here is just an example of some of the Mpds categories and their minimum inspection frequency. These are the goals outlined in Hawaii CMS, and this is just to give you an idea. So for example, if you are in our individual major category, so those are like our POTWs that discharge 1 million gallons per day, or also some certain industrial wastewater dischargers. They can expect to be inspected once every 2 years. We are committed to auditing our MS4s at least once per permit term, and our permit terms are for 5 years. And for our industrial and construction stormwater permits, we committed to inspecting 10% of our permit universe annually. There are more other categories in the CMS, but like pretreatment and CAFOs, but these are the more common ones. So on average, we do about 60 to 80 inspections per year. And I know that's not impressive to some of you, considering the MS4 programs can do way more than that. But again, this is all based on our capacity. So using 2020 as an example, you can see that the largest chunk of Mpds permits that were inspected were construction stormwater, which makes a lot of sense considering that this makes up the largest portion of our permit universe. Just as a side note, we get kind of bent in shape when you don't submit your NOCs, because it makes our permit universe a lot larger than it really is. And we don't like that. So please submit your NOCs when your project is complete. Otherwise, we can field site you for that. The next largest would be our industrial stormwaters, followed by our majors and some traditional non-majors. And then we also were able to get to our MS4s this year as well. So since majority of the Mpds construction stormwater universe exists on Oahu, it also falls under MS4 covered jurisdiction. And since these Mpds regulated construction sites are already inspected and regulated by either a city and county or DOT, they are less likely to see us. Instead, we will put priority on Kauai and Big Island, as they lack Mpds MS4 programs. However, we will always continue to maintain enforcement presence on Oahu and Maui, and the DOH will prioritize conducting inspections of construction sites on those islands based on referrals from the MS4 programs. So of the inspections that we do, we issue anywhere from 30 to 50 formal enforcement actions. Looks like 2018 was a productive year for us. I think we are probably fully staffed that year, and that's why that number is much higher. The largest chunk of those are field citations, which is misleading because we don't actually write them in the field, and they're not citations like a police officer would write. But nevertheless, that's the name they're given. Field citations are used for less severe violations with smaller penalties. We find field citations to be very effective. They can run from $500 for a first violation up to $2,000 for a second violation of the same nature. We also utilize notice of violations and orders, or NOVOs, and administrative order and consent, so AOCs. We really like our acronyms here. And those are used for more severe violations requiring more corrective measures, and carrying higher penalties, taking into account our statutory max of $25,000. Novels range anywhere from 5,000 to a few hundred thousand, and AOCs are anywhere higher than that, even up to $1 million. So just to be clear, because this is a very common misunderstanding, we are not bounty hunters at all, okay? Our commitments are not based on how many enforcement actions we issue or how many penalties we collect. In fact, we personally don't see the money at all. I believe it goes into an account that gets used for emergency responses. So penalties do not pay salaries, okay? Penalties are assessed using our penalty guidance, and at the direction of our previous director, we recently revised our penalty guidance. We've increased the penalty amount for some violations. We expanded it to include more factors. We added penalties for violations of animal feeding operations, since we did have to deal with our first CAFO case on the Big Island a few years ago. And we've also added violations for in-water work, since we've been seeing a lot of those lately. So next, I'm just gonna go through and provide examples of some common violations that we typically encounter using our penalty guidance, showing a comparison of less serious to more serious violation and what the penalty assessment could look like. So for this first example, it's a construction activity that had an Mpds permit. And let's say that it was 40 acres of disturbance and there was BMPs implemented, but there was a discharge and it minimally impacted the environment. Well, you could see about a $10,000 per day violation or a penalty assessed for that. Versus if you had 40 acres of disturbance and you had no BMPs, so therefore your discharge caused harm to the environment, then the statutory max of $25,000 per day would kick in. So the penalty amounts are based on the severity of the discharge, assuming the volume of the discharge is proportional to the size of the site. So it's really important to incorporate phasing, because the more area that you have disturbed and exposed, and if you have a discharge, a polluted discharge, the higher your penalty will be. This next example is when there is in-water work violations, and they're considered when a person fails to comply with the conditions of a DOH issued water quality certificate, or they fail to comply with the federal permit that the Army Corps issued, or if the activity was conducted without DOH's authorization. So for example, if you were in the water and you did work for 7 days, although you had BMPs implemented, you could get a $500 for each of those 7 days penalty. Versus if you were in the water for 60 days with BMPs implemented, that number could jump up to $10,000 for each of those 60 days. And the reason for this is that, you know, every day that you're in the water, there's going to be impacts to that water. And so the duration of activity is used as a proxy for the magnitude of the discharge. The level of mitigation in the form of BMP implementation is also considered though. And then for this last example is an unauthorized discharge of domestic wastewater, and this includes spills or bypasses at a wastewater treatment plant. So for example, if you had 10,000 gallons discharged of tertiary treated wastewater, you could get a penalty assessed of $8,000 per day. Versus if you discharge 10,000 gallons of untreated raw sewage, then that number jumps up pretty quickly to $25,000 per day. So for this example, the penalty amount is based on the severity of the discharge, which considers the volume of the discharge, the level of pollution based on the degree of treatment, and the sensitivity of the receiving water. So the higher the volume, the higher the penalty. If the receiving water is sensitive, then it would be a higher penalty for that as well. So the penalty guidance is applicable to a long list of activities or discharges. Keep in mind that this is only guidance, it's not policy. This is for us to use as a starting point for our recommendation to the director. The director ultimately has the final say, and she may choose for it to be higher or lower, but oftentimes we're told to actually go higher. So just to recap, high risk of pollution takes the highest priority for us. Projects that are already inspected by either the city or DOT are gonna less likely see us since they already have robust programs. So instead, we will be concentrating our efforts on the neighbor islands. We also do a lot of recon on Oahu especially. So if your site looks like a mess from the outside, you could definitely be sure that we will inspect you. And then right now we have a non-filer initiative for those activities that require Mpds permit. We've been spending the last few months in the Campbell industrial area, trying to hit up all the non-filers over there. And lastly, we are prioritizing in-water work activities. It's been on our radar. If you've listened to the city's workshop a couple of weeks ago, you would have seen all of the enforcement actions that we've issued recently with regards to violations for that. So I hope that gives you guys a better idea of how we target inspections so that you could be better prepared for when we do show up. But at least you know now that we don't just pick them at random. We actually do have a process. And this is our contact information if you ever need to get a hold of us for whatever reasons, or if you just want to talk story. That's it. That's all I got, guys.
Thank you, Matt and Bobby, for your presentations. We are now going to open up the question and answer portion of the session. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A section now. We'll start off with the first question. How will utilities like HECO and Board of Water Supply that own access roads to facilities not necessarily covered under specific industrial stormwater permits, storage tank sites and pump sites or transformer sites be affected? Could the sum of all these facilities be enough to trigger non-point permit coverage requirements? Are the utilities going to be required to justify why these non-point requirements do not apply to them?
Okay, I can answer that a little. It's a really long conversation, but let me just say that, first of all, it's not a permit, but essentially, again, without getting into the point, non-point, whether you're HECO or BWS or anybody else, if you have a particular activity that's significantly pollution causing, then you need to be mitigating that, you know, whether it's covered explicitly under the new non-point source rules or whether it's covered under a future Mpds permit, you should be covering it anyway. I think it might, you know, I hike a little bit, real little bit. But if you meaning kind of like when you go up to the HECO towers and things like that in forestry areas, a lot of those activities are actually overseen under DOFA's forestry programs. And there are specific BMPs that are required to be putting in when you're cutting in access roads and such. It doesn't get explicitly caught under the non-point source rules, but if there's a significant pollution source, period, let's just say anything, then the DOH will have to ask itself, is this something that's best covered under the Mpds program or this hopefully covered under the new non-point source program? And depending on the situation, depending on what it is, it may trigger a different regulatory path. Chelsea, did you want to prompt the questions or you want us to blow through them, or?
Whatever works easier for you is fine.
I can start going through them. And I think everybody sees them, so I'm not going to read them. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, everyone should be able to see these questions.
Okay, and first of all, I apologize. I only saw in the chat. I guess I wasn't on a maximized screen. Sorry about that. Turns out it's not my first Zoom meeting, but apparently you don't get better at them. Okay. How to handle disputes with your contractor? Okay, if you're an Mpds regulated facility, you should have that in your SWAMP or your SWIP about how you're going to take care of it. But the short version is this, you know, the disputes, I've said this before, disputes often come when you're trying to fight about an abstract, like, was this a discharge or was it not a discharge? Well, discharge defined by how, look, if whatever came off your site caused a water pollution impact, then it should be clear on who's responsible for it. And if it's not, then you really need to go back to your contract documents and you need to figure out what that is, because it's different on how you would deal with your contractor depending on what your contract documents say. But know that owner or operator could be held responsible by the DOH for that discharge. And our process recently has been to go after both. What is our enforcement section, not branch, definition of in-water work? Okay. The regulatory distinction is if it's something that would need a 402 permit, meaning Mpds, you're out of the water. If it's something that would require a 404 permit, then you'd be in water. But the short one is if you are in the stream proper or ocean proper, whether your equipment or your BMPs, where you have to place anything within the water body itself, then you're in water work. I hope that answers it. And you know, hit the question thing if it's not. What should we have on hand for DOH inspections? It depends what you are. So if you're an MS4 permittee, you need to have a lot. If you're a construction contractor, then you need to have the copy of your permit, copy of the NOI, and your stormwater pollution prevention plan. That's probably the most important things to have. If we could only choose two, have a copy of your permit, and certainly have your stormwater pollution prevention plan, the most current one that's signed and certified by the duly authorized representative. If you don't have one of those two documents, that's $500 off the bat. Right? And Bobbie's serious about the NOCs. It's really important to us because all of the information that's in our local database is projected on the national database. And we have metrics that we have to meet for how clean our data is. So if we have a whole bunch of, so if we plan an inspection for your site and we go and your site is done and it's been done for a while and you never turned in your NOC, that's gonna be $500, which may not break the bank for you folks, but I don't think anybody likes to get a parking ticket for not turning in something. But to be fair, the reason why is because, like everybody loves to point out with us, you all pay our salaries. So sending us on a wild goose chase and wasting our day or travel or whatever it is does cost everybody money. So as a permittee, it's your responsibility to make sure you get your permit, and it's your responsibility to make sure you close out your permit when you're done. Just that's the only ones I see in the Q&A box. Is there anything else you'd like us to share? I think there was a question about the presentations being posted. I leave that to H.
Yes, so the videos will be posted on the website for 30 days after the conference. But I don't see any other questions. Does anyone else have any other questions they have for Matt or Bobbie?
Oh, I see one more. Is it better to self-report discharges? Can I answer that one?
Yes.
We have yet to penalize somebody for self-reporting a discharge, unless you're like a wastewater treatment plant. But like if I think this is more like construction or, you know, that type. We have yet to penalize somebody for self-reporting, but we have always penalized people for not reporting. So that there's always a first. You could have had a really bad one and you will pay a penalty for even if you self-reported it. But if we find out that you didn't report, I can tell you that will always be included. So there, if there's a discharge, and there often is when we take an enforcement action, and we have to discover it ourselves, you have two violations. You have the discharge violation under 342D50, and you also have a non-reporting violation under 342D55. And that's an additional up to $10,000 a day. And there's a reason for this. This is really important for everybody to understand. Our primary purpose is to ensure protection of public health and the environment, but public health. If there's a discharge, we need to know about it, because if we need to warn the public, we need to know about it. So if there was a discharge that necessitated us acting or taking a penalty or requiring corrective action, and no, it was never notified to us, we have always been directed to make sure they pay a penalty for not reporting to. So I think that's an important distinction. Better to report and let us make the determination about whether we need to warn the public, or rather than not reporting, and then we find out. And then God forbid, the worst case scenario is that the discharge itself truly endangered. And we use that word, Bobbie used it kind of in the penalty policy, but if you are found to have endangered the public, that is not a fining penalty anymore. You will be dealing with criminal investigators. And that is a personal liability that is punishable by up to 2 years in jail, I think. We don't do that though. We would just, you know, be aware of your misery. Is there a penalty for the discharge? Oh, I think I got that one.
Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, thank you again, Matt and Bobbie. This now concludes this session, and thank you everyone for attending. The next session will begin at 1 p.m. and the vendors will be around during the break if you would like to chat with them. If you have experienced any technical issues and need any assistance, please visit the info desk and we'll see you after lunch. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Take care.
Bye.